The blood-soaked telegram trembled in Nora Spencer's hands as she read the words that would forever alter her life. Her husband of 3 years was dead, killed in a mining accident that had claimed 12 other lives in Silver Creek, Colorado. The year was 1878, and at 23 Nora had become what no young woman wished to be: a widow with a tarnished name and uncertain future. "Madam, I'm truly sorry," said the telegrapher, a thin man with kind eyes who'd delivered such news too many times in this frontier town. "John was a good man." Nora nodded numbly, clutching the paper as though it might somehow bring back her husband. But John wouldn't return, and neither would the truth about what had really happened at the Silver Creek mine. 3 months after the accident, Nora still lived in the small cabin on the outskirts of Silver Creek that she and John had called home. The whispers had started almost immediately after the accident. At first they were sympathetic murmurs, neighbors bringing food and offering condolences. Then came the rumors that John Spencer had been drunk, that he'd ignored safety warnings, that the deaths of 12 men rested on his negligent shoulders. "He was inspecting the supports," Nora insisted to anyone who would listen. The company records proved he'd reported the danger weeks before, but Silver Creek Mining Company had powerful friends, and somehow those records disappeared. In their place came affidavits from survivors claiming John had been drinking that day, that he'd been careless. The mining company needed a scapegoat to avoid responsibility, and a dead man couldn't defend himself. The widow of the man who killed 12 miners was no longer welcome in Silver Creek. On a bitter autumn morning, Nora stood on her porch watching as riders approached her cabin. She recognized Frank Holloway, the mine owner's son, leading 3 other men. Their expressions told her everything she needed to know. "Mrs. Spencer," Frank called out, not bothering to dismount. "Town council's given you notice 3 times now." "This is my home," Nora replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My husband built it with his own hands." "Your husband killed 12 men with his carelessness," Frank spat. "Their widows and children deserve justice. The deed's been revoked. You've got until sundown to clear out." Nora's fingers gripped the porch railing. "That's not legal, and you know it," Frank sneered. "Nothing's legal or illegal out here unless people agree it is. And nobody's agreeing with you anymore, Mrs. Spencer. Not after what happened." As the men rode away, Nora felt the weight of her isolation pressing down on her. With John's name blackened and no family of her own, she had no advocates in Silver Creek. The town had made its judgment, and she stood condemned. By sunset, Nora had packed what little she could carry: some clothes, a few photographs, John's pocket watch, and the small amount of money they'd saved. As darkness fell, she looked back at the cabin one last time. Tomorrow, she knew, men from town would come to claim it, perhaps even burn it down to erase the memory of John Spencer. Nora walked through the night, following the stagecoach road. When dawn broke, she reached the neighboring settlement of Whispering Pines, a town barely larger than Silver Creek, but far enough away that perhaps the rumors hadn't spread. With her remaining money, she purchased a ticket on the eastbound stagecoach. The driver looked at her with curiosity, but asked no questions as he loaded her single bag. "Where are you headed, miss?" he asked as they pulled away. "Anywhere that isn't here," Nora replied, watching as the mountains that had been her home for 3 years receded into the distance. 2 weeks and several connections later, Nora stepped off a stagecoach in Redemption, Arizona territory, a growing town built around cattle ranching and the newly constructed railroad. At the edge of the Sonoran Desert, Redemption was harsh and beautiful, a place where the sky seemed endless and the land unforgiving. Nora had chosen it because of a newspaper advertisement seeking a schoolteacher. With her education from a women's college back east, she was qualified, though she'd never taught formally. More importantly, it was far from Colorado, far from the whispers and accusations. The town's hotel was modest but clean. As Nora approached the desk, the older woman behind it gave her a curious look. "Room for one," Nora said, placing coins on the counter. "Just passing through?" the woman asked. "No, I hope to stay," Nora replied. "I've come about the teaching position." The woman's expression brightened. "Mrs. Patterson, I run this place. The school's been empty since Miss Tillman left to get married last spring. The children are running wild." "Then I've arrived at the right time," Nora said with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You'll want to speak with Mayor Collins first thing tomorrow," Mrs. Patterson said, handing over a key. Room 3, top of the stairs. That evening, Nora sat by her window, watching the bustling main street of Redemption. Cowboys and townspeople moved about their business as the sun set in spectacular fashion over the distant mountains. For the first time since John's death, she felt a faint glimmer of hope. Perhaps here, where no one knew her, she could start again. The next morning, Nora dressed carefully in her best dress, a navy blue cotton that was becoming threadbare at the cuffs, but still respectable, and made her way to the mayor's office. Mayor Collins was a portly man with an impressive mustache and a businessman's calculating gaze. "Mrs. Spencer, is it?" he asked, gesturing for her to sit. "Yes, sir. I understand you're in need of a teacher." "Indeed we are. 37 children of varying ages, from 6 to 16. He studied her. "You have experience?" "I was educated at Hartford Women's Seminary," Nora said, "though I haven't taught in a formal setting. I tutored younger students during my time there." The mayor nodded slowly. "We can't offer much. $50 a month, plus accommodations in the rooms above the schoolhouse." It was less than she'd hoped for, but enough to survive on. "That would be acceptable." "Very well," the mayor said, rising to his feet. "School's been closed for months. It'll need a good cleaning. But you can start next Monday if that suits." "It does. Thank you, Mayor Collins." As Nora left the office, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had a purpose again, a reason to rise each morning. As long as her past remained in Colorado, she could build something new here. For 3 months, Nora found a rhythm in Redemption. The schoolhouse was indeed in need of attention, but she transformed it into a welcoming place for learning. The children, initially wary of their new teacher, gradually warmed to her patient methods and genuine interest in their progress. Parents nodded respectfully when they saw her in town, and for the first time since John's death, Nora felt something like belonging. She kept to herself outside of school hours, declining invitations to social gatherings and church functions. The less people knew about her, the safer her fresh start would be. Nora Spencer, the widow from nowhere in particular, was quietly building a respectable life. Then came the letter. It arrived with the weekly mail delivery, addressed in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a brief message that turned her blood cold. "People in Redemption should know what kind of woman teaches their children. Ask her about Silver Creek." The letter wasn't signed, but Nora knew it could only have come from someone in Silver Creek, perhaps Frank Holloway, or one of the other men who'd driven her away. How they'd found her, she couldn't guess, but the threat was clear. That evening, as Nora paced her small rooms above the schoolhouse, a knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Mayor Collins stood there, his expression grave, the letter in his hand. "This came to my office this afternoon," he said without preamble. "Care to explain?" Nora's hands trembled as she invited him in. There was little use in denial. The truth would emerge one way or another. "My husband died in a mining accident in Silver Creek, Colorado," she began, her voice steady despite her fear. 13 men were killed. The company blamed John for the collapse, said he was drunk and negligent. The mayor listened silently as she continued. "It wasn't true. John had reported the dangerous conditions weeks before, but the company needed someone to blame." She took a deep breath. "They turned the town against me. I had no choice but to leave." Mayor Collins studied her for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me this when you applied for the position?" "Would you have hired me if you'd known?" Nora asked. He didn't answer directly, which was answer enough. Parents are already asking questions. Word spreads fast in a town like this. "I've done nothing wrong," Nora insisted. "I'm a good teacher. The children are learning." "That may be," the mayor said, rising to his feet. "But this town has its reputation to consider. The school board will meet tomorrow. I suggest you prepare yourself." After he left, Nora sank into a chair, the familiar despair washing over her. She'd known this peace couldn't last, that her past would eventually find her. The question now was whether to stand and fight or flee once more. The school board meeting was held in the town hall the following evening. Nora sat alone at a small table facing 5 board members, including Mayor Collins. Behind her, it seemed half the town had gathered to witness the proceedings. "Mrs. Spencer," began Theodore Harper, the board chairman, "serious allegations have been brought to our attention regarding your past in Silver Creek, Colorado." "They aren't allegations, Mr. Harper," Nora replied. My husband died in a mining accident. The company falsely blamed him to avoid responsibility. We've received telegrams from Silver Creek, Harper continued, holding up several papers. The mine owner, the sheriff, and the town council all confirm that your husband's negligence caused the deaths of 12 men. Murmurs rippled through the crowd behind her. Nora straightened her spine. They're protecting themselves and their profits, she said clearly. John reported the dangerous conditions. The company ignored him. Do you have proof of this? Mayor Collins asked. Nora's silence was damning. Any documentation had disappeared along with the company records. I thought not, Harper said. Mrs. Spencer, while your teaching has been satisfactory, we cannot have someone of questionable character influencing our children. My character is not questionable, Nora countered, her voice rising. I've done nothing wrong, neither did my husband. Nevertheless, Harper continued, the board has voted. Your services will no longer be required, effective immediately. The finality in his voice echoed through the room. Nora looked around at the faces of parents whose children she'd taught, neighbors she'd greeted on the street. Most avoided her gaze. A few looked sympathetic, but remained silent. As Nora gathered her belongings to leave, a voice rang out from the back of the hall. This isn't justice. Heads turned to see a tall man in dusty riding clothes standing in the doorway. His face was partially shadowed by his hat, but his voice carried authority. This is a town meeting, mister, Mayor Collins said. State your business or move along. The man stepped further into the light. He was perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had seen their share of hardship. A silver star glinted on his vest, a U.S. Marshal's badge. Marshal Dawson Calloway, he introduced himself. I've been tracking a case that involves Silver Creek Mining Company. Thought folks here might want to know the truth before you run an innocent woman out of town. A ripple of whispers passed through the crowd as the marshal walked forward, removing his hat. He nodded respectfully to Nora before turning to the board. Silver Creek Mining's been under federal investigation for the past 6 months, he continued. 3 weeks ago, we arrested the owner and superintendent for falsifying safety records and bribing officials to overlook violations. Mayor Collins frowned. What does this have to do with Mrs. Spencer? Everything, Marshal Calloway replied. Her husband, John Spencer, filed 3 official complaints about unsafe conditions. After the collapse, those records mysteriously disappeared, but federal inspectors found copies in the Denver office. He reached into his jacket and withdrew several folded papers. John Spencer was trying to prevent exactly what happened. When he died in that collapse, the company fabricated evidence to blame him rather than face penalties for their negligence. The room fell silent as the marshal handed the documents to Mayor Collins. Nora stared at the papers, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. Why are you here, Marshal? Harper asked suspiciously. Following evidence, Calloway replied, and making sure justice is properly served. Mrs. Spencer's reputation was destroyed by criminals protecting their profits. I thought redemption might live up to its name. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances as they reviewed the documents. Finally, Mayor Collins cleared his throat. This changes matters considerably, he admitted. However, the situation has caused significant disruption in our community. So you'd punish her a second time for something she didn't do? Marshal Calloway asked quietly. Before anyone could respond, Elizabeth Montgomery, mother of 3 of Nora's students, stood from her seat in the crowd. My children have learned more in 3 months with Mrs. Spencer than in a year with Miss Tillman, she said firmly. I don't care what happened in Colorado. She's a good teacher. Others began to voice similar sentiments, though some remained stubbornly opposed. The meeting dissolved into heated debate until Mayor Collins pounded his gavel for order. The board will need to reconsider in light of this new information, he announced. We'll reconvene tomorrow. Until then, no decision about Mrs. Spencer's position will be finalized. As the crowd dispersed, Nora remained seated, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. Marshal Calloway approached her table. Mrs. Spencer, he said, his voice gentler than before. I apologize for arriving at the last minute. Took longer than expected to track you down. Nora looked up at him, struggling to comprehend. You were looking for me? Why? Part of setting things right, he replied. The company's going to be making restitution to the families of those killed, including yours. and your husband's name needs to be cleared publicly." "Thank you," Nora said, finding the words inadequate. "I never thought anyone would believe me." "Truth has a way of surfacing eventually," Marshal Calloway said, "though sometimes it needs a bit of help." He glanced around. "Do you have somewhere we could talk further? There are details about your husband's case I should share with you." They settled in a quiet corner of Mrs. Patterson's hotel dining room, where the marshal ordered coffee for them both. In the lamplight, Nora could see him more clearly, the lines around his eyes that spoke of both humor and hardship. The careful way he watched the room's entrances, the calloused hands that suggested he'd worked hard before wearing a lawman's badge. "I was assigned to investigate Silver Creek after reports of multiple safety violations," he explained. "Your husband's case caught my attention because the evidence didn't add up." "How did you find those records?" Nora asked. "A clerk in the Denver office had kept copies," Calloway replied. "He suspected something wasn't right, but was afraid to come forward until we started investigating." He hesitated before continuing. "Mrs. Spencer, your husband did more than just file complaints. The night before the collapse, he sent a detailed letter to the territorial mining inspector. It arrived too late to prevent the accident, but it provided crucial evidence." Nora's throat tightened. "He never told me." "He was trying to protect you," Marshal Calloway said gently. "The letter mentioned threats from the mine superintendent. If John spoke publicly about the conditions, he'd lose his job, or worse. The implications of this settled heavily between them. John had died trying to save lives, including his own, while protecting Nora from the dangerous truth. "What happens now?" Nora asked. "The company officials will stand trial in Denver next month," Calloway replied. "Your testimony would be valuable, if you're willing to appear." Nora nodded without hesitation. "I'll be there." As they finished their coffee, the marshal seemed reluctant to conclude their conversation. "Will you stay in redemption if they allow you to keep teaching?" "I don't know," Nora admitted. "Even with the truth revealed, there will always be those who doubt." "That's true anywhere," Calloway said. "But running doesn't end it. Sometimes you have to stand your ground." His words stayed with Nora long after they parted for the evening. For months, she'd been fleeing her past, hoping distance would somehow erase it. Perhaps it was time to face it instead. The next morning, Nora walked to the schoolhouse early, uncertain whether she'd be permitted to teach. To her surprise, several parents were waiting with their children, including Elizabeth Montgomery. "We're here for school, Mrs. Spencer," Elizabeth said simply. "Board meeting isn't until evening." Gratitude swelled in Nora's chest as she unlocked the door. Whatever the board decided, she knew now that she wasn't entirely alone. The day passed in a semblance of normality, though Nora was acutely aware of the undercurrents of tension. Some children were absent, kept home by parents who remained unconvinced of her character. But those present gave her reason to hope. As the children departed for the day, Marshal Calloway appeared at the schoolhouse door. He'd exchanged his trail-worn clothes for a clean shirt and vest, though he still wore his gun belt, a lawman even when dressed for town. "Thought you might want company walking to the meeting," he offered. They walked side by side through the dusty streets of Redemption as the sun began its descent. Nora was painfully aware of the stares and whispers they attracted. "Everyone's watching us?" she murmured. "Let them," Calloway replied. "Gives them something to talk about besides cattle prices." His casual confidence steadied her as they approached the town hall. Inside, the room was even more crowded than the previous evening. The marshal took a seat in the back, leaving Nora to face the board alone. Again, a subtle understanding that this was her battle to fight. Mayor Collins called the meeting to order. After reviewing the evidence provided by Marshal Calloway and further telegraphic correspondence with authorities in Denver, the board has reconsidered Mrs. Spencer's position. Nora held her breath as he continued. "The documents verify that John Spencer was indeed attempting to prevent the tragedy that occurred, and that evidence was falsified to posthumously blame him." Collins looked uncomfortable with this admission. In light of this, the board withdraws its previous decision regarding Mrs. Spencer's employment. Relieved murmurs spread through the crowd, but Harper raised his hand. "There remains the issue of community trust. While Mrs. Spencer may be cleared of wrongdoing, the controversy has caused division." "If I may," Nora said, rising to her feet, "I came to Redemption seeking a fresh start, believing that hiding my past was the only way forward. I was wrong." She turned to face the townspeople. My husband died trying to protect minors, including himself, from dangerous conditions. I will never apologize for defending his name, but I do regret not being honest with you from the beginning. Nora paused, gathering her thoughts. If you allow me to continue teaching your children, I promise to teach them not just reading and arithmetic, but the value of truth and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Elizabeth Montgomery stood again. My children need that lesson as much as they need their schooling. I say Mrs. Spencer stays. Others voiced agreement, though some remained silent or shook their heads. The division was clear, but the majority appeared to support her. Mayor Collins nodded slowly. Very well. Mrs. Spencer will continue as Redemption schoolteacher. This meeting is adjourned. As the crowd dispersed, Nora found herself surrounded by well-wishers, parents, and townspeople who expressed support or simply wanted to hear more of her story firsthand. By the time she extricated herself, Marshal Calloway was waiting near the door. Congratulations, he said, falling into step beside her as they left the hall. Takes courage to stand up like that. It feels strange, Nora admitted. For months I've been trying to disappear, to be someone new. Now everyone knows exactly who I am. And they're still standing with you, Calloway observed. That's rare. They walked in companionable silence for a moment before he spoke again. I need to ride out tomorrow. There's a circuit judge in Tucson. I need to brief about the Silver Creek case. Disappointment settled in Nora's chest, surprising her with its intensity. Will you return for the trial in Denver? I'll escort you there myself, if you'll allow it, he replied. It's about a month away. I should be back in Redemption 2 weeks before then. That would be appreciated, Nora said, trying to keep her tone neutral. As they reached the schoolhouse, Calloway hesitated. Mrs. Spencer, Nora, I know this isn't the proper time, but I'd like to write to you while I'm away. If that would be welcome. The unexpected request brought warmth to Nora's cheeks. It would be very welcome, Marshal Calloway. Dawson, please, he said with a slight smile. Only outlaws call me Marshal. Dawson, she repeated, liking the feel of his name. I look forward to your letters. He tipped his hat and turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. I heard what they said about you in Silver Creek, that no one could love you after what happened. His eyes met hers steadily. They were wrong. Before Nora could respond, he walked away into the gathering darkness, leaving her with a fluttering heart and the first real hope she'd felt since John's death. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Nora threw herself into teaching with renewed energy, determined to prove herself worthy of the town's second chance. Most of her students had returned, though a few families had withdrawn their children permanently. The loss stung, but Nora focused on those who remained. True to his word, Dawson's first letter arrived 5 days after his departure. His handwriting was surprisingly neat for a man accustomed to life in the saddle. Nora, Tucson is hot as blazes and twice as dusty. The judge here is a good man, though his fondness for lengthy deliberations tests my patience. I find my thoughts returning to Redemption more often than my duties require. I've enclosed a news clipping from the Territorial Star regarding the Silver Creek Mining Company arrests. Thought you might want to see justice beginning to take shape. The territorial governor has ordered a full investigation of all their operations. How are you faring? Has the town truly accepted the truth, or do you still face whispers? I find myself concerned for your well-being in a way that exceeds my professional interest in your case. Until I return, Dawson. Nora read the letter multiple times that evening, analyzing each line for deeper meaning. The formal tone couldn't quite disguise an undercurrent of personal interest that made her heart beat faster. That night, she wrote a careful response. Dawson, thank you for the news clipping. It brings me more peace than I can express to see John's name cleared in print after so many months of injustice. Redemption is gradually accepting me again. The children ask about you occasionally. You made quite an impression. Billy Montgomery insists he wants to be a marshal when he grows up. Though at 7 years old, his ideas change weekly. The school board has approved my proposal for a small library. Books are scarce here, and many children have never read anything beyond their Bible lessons. I've written to my former seminary requesting donations of basic texts. I hope your work concludes swiftly and safely. Redemption feels different knowing you'll return. With gratitude, Nora. She hesitated over the closing, wanting to express more but uncertain how proper it would be. In the end, gratitude seemed safe yet genuine. Their correspondence continued over the following weeks. Each letter became gradually less formal, sharing small details of daily life and revealing pieces of themselves. Dawson wrote of his childhood in Missouri, his years working cattle before becoming a lawman, and his belief in justice even in lawless territories. Nora shared stories of her students, her memories of the East, and eventually tender recollections of her life with John. "I worry sometimes," she wrote in her fourth letter, "that speaking of John to you is inappropriate given the nature of our correspondence. Yet, he was a good man who deserves to be remembered honestly." Dawson's reply came quickly. "Never apologize for honoring his memory. A man who dies protecting others deserves to be remembered, and you deserve the freedom to speak of your past without fear." As promised, Dawson returned to Redemption 2 weeks before they were due to travel to Denver. Nora was teaching arithmetic to her older students when a shadow fell across the schoolroom door. The children noticed him first, excited whispers spreading until Nora turned to see Dawson leaning against the doorframe, trail dust still on his clothes. "Marshal Calloway," she said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "Rode ahead of schedule," he replied, his eyes fixed on her. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all. We're just finishing our lesson." She turned to the class. "Children, you remember Marshal Calloway." A chorus of greetings rose from the students. Billy Montgomery proudly showed the tin star he'd fashioned from scrap metal, pinned to his shirt like a badge. "Impressive deputy you've got there, Mrs. Spencer," Dawson said with a grin. When school dismissed, Dawson remained, helping Nora straighten the room. His presence filled the small schoolhouse in a way that made it difficult for her to concentrate on simple tasks. "I've arranged for the stagecoach tickets to Denver," he said as they worked. "We leave in 12 days. The trial begins the following Monday." "I'm nervous," Nora admitted. "I haven't been back to Colorado since I left." "You won't be alone this time," Dawson assured her. The promise in those words extended beyond the upcoming journey, and they both knew it. Over the next 2 weeks, Dawson became a familiar figure in Redemption. He sometimes sat at the back of the schoolroom, observing Nora's teaching with evident admiration. Evenings often found them walking together or sharing simple meals at Mrs. Patterson's hotel. Town gossip inevitably followed, but for once, Nora found herself unbothered by whispers. The speculation was benign compared to what she'd endured before, and there was truth to it. She was developing feelings for the marshal, deeper than gratitude or friendship. 3 days before their departure for Denver, Dawson invited Nora for a ride into the desert to see the sunset. They rode side by side, Nora on a gentle mare borrowed from the livery stable, until they reached a rise overlooking the vast landscape. The sky was beginning to transform into brilliant shades of orange and purple as they dismounted. "It's beautiful," Nora said, gazing at the horizon. "It is," Dawson agreed, though when she turned, she found him looking at her rather than the sunset. They stood in comfortable silence as colors blazed across the sky, gradually deepening into twilight. Stars began to appear, impossibly bright in the clear desert air. "Nora," Dawson said finally, turning to face her, "before we go to Denver, there's something I need to tell you." She met his gaze steadily, heart quickening. "Yes? When I first took this case, it was just work another investigation. But finding the truth about your husband, tracking you to Redemption, somewhere along the way, it became personal." He took a deep breath. "I know it hasn't been long since we met, and your heart's still healing. I don't expect anything. But I wanted you to know that I care for you, deeply." Nora's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sorrow. "In Silver Creek, after the accusations, someone said no one could ever love me after what happened, that I was tainted by association." Dawson's expression hardened. "They were wrong." "I know," Nora whispered, "because you've shown me they were wrong." He stepped closer, gently taking her hand. "I'm not asking for promises, just permission to keep showing you that they were wrong, for as long as you'll allow it." In answer, Nora rose on her tiptoes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. "I think I'd like that very much." The journey to Denver was long and often uncomfortable, but Nora barely noticed the hardships. Dawson's steady presence beside her transformed what should have been a dreaded return into something almost like an adventure. They traveled by stagecoach to Tucson, then by train, Nora's first rail journey to Denver. As they approached Colorado, anxiety began to resurface. Dawson seemed to sense her unease, offering quiet reassurance without pushing her to discuss her fears. By the time they reached Denver, Nora had steeled herself for what lay ahead. The trial of the Silver Creek Mining Company officials began on a crisp October morning. Nora testified on the second day, recounting John's concerns about the mine's safety and the subsequent smear campaign against his memory. Her voice never wavered, even as defense attorneys attempted to undermine her credibility. "Your husband had a history of troublemaking, did he not, Mrs. Spencer?" the company's lawyer asked. "John had a history of standing up for safety," Nora corrected firmly. "If that's troublemaking, then yes." From his seat in the courtroom, Dawson watched with undisguised pride. When the verdict came a week later, guilty on all counts, Nora wept openly. Justice wouldn't bring John back, but it restored his good name and ensured the company would pay for its negligence. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to document the landmark case. One approached Nora as she descended the steps with Dawson at her side. "Mrs. Spencer, how does it feel to see your husband vindicated after all this time?" "Like a weight has been lifted," Nora replied honestly. "Not just from my shoulders, but from his memory." "And what will you do now? Return to Silver Creek?" The question gave her pause. She hadn't considered returning to the town that had driven her away. "Mrs. Spencer teaches in Redemption, Arizona Territory," Dawson interjected. "Her community needs her there." His use of community rather than students wasn't lost on Nora. Somehow, despite everything, she had found belonging again. That evening, in the privacy of the hotel's garden, Dawson took her hands in his. "You were remarkable in there. Not many would have had the courage to face down a courtroom like that." "It was time to stop running," Nora said. "You taught me that." "Redemption School Board telegraphed yesterday," Dawson said, changing the subject slightly. "They've extended your position for another year, with an increase in salary." Nora smiled. "I'd almost forgotten about regular life during all this." "Is that where you want to be?" he asked, his tone careful. "In Redemption?" "It feels like home now," she admitted. "What about you? Where does a U.S. Marshal call home?" Dawson's eyes held hers steadily. "I've been considering a change. The territorial governor offered me a position as sheriff in Maricopa County." "That's near Redemption?" Nora observed, her heart quickening. "About 2 hours' ride," Dawson confirmed. "Close enough to visit regularly, perhaps very regularly." The implication hung in the air between them, full of promise. Nora stepped closer. "I think I'd like that," she said softly. "Very regular visits." Under the Denver stars, far from where their story began, Dawson bent to kiss her properly for the first time. His lips were gentle against hers, a question rather than a demand. Nora answered by winding her arms around his neck, deepening the kiss with a certainty that surprised them both. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Dawson rested his forehead against hers. "They said no one could love you after what happened," he murmured. "I say they never really knew you at all." Their return journey to Arizona felt like the beginning of something rather than an ending. As mountains gave way to desert, Nora watched the changing landscape with a sense of anticipation rather than dread. The future that had once seemed so bleak now stretched before her, bright with possibility. In Redemption, they were greeted with a small celebration at the schoolhouse, organized by Elizabeth Montgomery and other supportive parents. News of the trial's outcome had preceded them, and the town seemed eager to share in Nora's vindication. Mayor Collins presented her with a formal document extending her teaching contract for another year. "Redemption is proud to have you, Mrs. Spencer," he said, the sincerity in his voice making up somewhat for his earlier doubts. As the gathering dispersed, Dawson walked Nora back to her rooms above the schoolhouse. Unlike their previous farewells, this one held no sadness, only anticipation. "I ride for Maricopa tomorrow to accept the sheriff's position," he told her, "but I'll be back in 2 weeks." "I'll be here," Nora promised. Teaching arithmetic and waiting for letters from the new sheriff. Dawson smiled, touching her cheek gently. You know, a sheriff needs a home to come back to, not just a rented room in a jailhouse. Is that so? Nora asked, understanding his meaning. It is, he confirmed, and a proper courtship might be in order, now that we're settled. Proper, but not too long, I hope, Nora said with unexpected boldness that made him laugh. No, not too long, Dawson agreed, kissing her once more before reluctantly taking his leave. True to his word, Dawson returned to Redemption every 2 weeks as autumn deepened toward winter. Their courtship proceeded with a blend of propriety and genuine passion that set tongues wagging throughout the territory. By Christmas, few were surprised when Dawson escorted Nora to the town's holiday celebration, wearing a new dress he'd gifted her. The deep green velvet, a stark contrast to the practical clothes she typically wore. As they danced in the decorated town hall, Dawson leaned close to whisper, I have another gift, one I couldn't give you in public. Later, in the privacy of her sitting room, he presented her with a small box. Inside was a simple gold ring set with a modest diamond. I know it's been less than a year since we met, Dawson said, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. And if it's too soon, I understand. But I love you, Nora. I want to build a life with you. Tears filled Nora's eyes as she looked from the ring to his face. When John died, I thought that part of my life was over forever. I never imagined I could feel this way again. Is that a yes? Dawson asked, hope evident in his voice. It's a yes, Nora confirmed, laughing through her tears as he slipped the ring onto her finger. They were married in the spring of 1880, when wildflowers bloomed across the desert and Redemption's orchards filled with blossoms. The ceremony took place in the schoolhouse, transformed by Nora's students with paper decorations and flowers. Elizabeth Montgomery stood as Nora's attendant, and the territorial judge who had presided over the Silver Creek trial traveled from Tucson to perform the ceremony. Nora wore a dress of ivory satin, ordered from a catalog and altered by the town's seamstress. As she walked toward Dawson, who waited in his best suit with barely contained emotion, she carried a bouquet containing a single rose from John's grave, a final tribute to the man who would always hold a piece of her heart. The judge spoke of new beginnings and second chances, words that resonated deeply with everyone who knew the couple's story. When it came time for their vows, Dawson's voice rang clear and confident. Nora, when I found you, you were fighting a battle alone that no one should have to face. I promise today that you'll never stand alone again. I'll be beside you through whatever life brings the joy and the hardship, the celebrations and the struggles. I promise to honor the past we both carry while building a future together filled with love and truth. Nora's response came from the heart, unplanned and honest. Dawson, you came into my life when I believed certain doors were forever closed to me. You didn't just solve a case or clear a name, you showed me that life continues, that love grows in unexpected places. I promise to walk forward with you, to build something beautiful from what once seemed broken, and to love you faithfully for all our days. Their new home, a modest house on the outskirts of Redemption, with a view of the mountains, became a gathering place for the community. Nora continued teaching, while Dawson's reputation as a fair but firm sheriff spread throughout the territory. When a school was built in Maricopa County the following year, Nora was offered the position of head teacher, allowing them to live together full-time rather than managing the 2-hour separation. In the summer of 1882, Nora gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Hope, her arrival cementing the new life they'd built from the ashes of tragedy. As Nora watched Dawson cradle their newborn with wonder in his eyes, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "What are you thinking?" Dawson asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About Silver Creek," Nora admitted. "About how something that seemed so completely devastating led, somehow, to this moment." Dawson nodded, understanding. "Life has strange paths. They said no one could ever love me after what happened," Nora recalled, touching her sleeping daughter's cheek. "And now, look at all this love." Dawson leaned over to kiss her forehead. "I told you they were wrong." 2 years later, their son John was born, named for the man whose memory they continued to honor. As the children grew, so did the legacy of truth and justice their parents had fought for. the Silver Creek Mining Company case became a precedent in territorial law, leading to improved safety regulations across Western mining operations. Occasionally, letters arrived from Silver Creek. Some were from widows who had eventually learned the truth and sought to make amends for their earlier cruelty. Others came from miners who had known John and wanted to share stories of his character. Each letter was a stitch in the healing of old wounds. On a warm evening in the summer of 1890, Nora and Dawson sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching their children play in the yard. Hope, now 8, was teaching 5-year-old John and their 3-year-old sister, Emma, how to catch fireflies in glass jars. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been assigned to investigate Silver Creek?" Nora asked, her hand finding Dawson's in the gathering darkness. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then, I remember something my father used to say, that the right paths find those who are looking for them." He squeezed her hand gently. "I think we would have found each other somehow." Nora smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "Then I believe that too." As twilight deepened into night and their children's laughter echoed across the yard, Nora Spencer Calloway understood that her story, one that had begun in tragedy and injustice, had transformed into something beautiful. Not by forgetting the past, but by carrying it forward into a future built on truth, courage, and a love that had defied every expectation. In a world that had once told her she was unlovable, she had found the deepest love. In a community that had once rejected her, she had found belonging. And in the man who had sworn to protect her, she had found not just a protector, but a partner in creating a life more fulfilling than she had ever imagined possible. The night John Spencer died in that mine, a light had gone out in Nora's world. But here, in the Arizona twilight, with Dawson's hand in hers and their children's voices filling the air, that darkness had given way to a different kind of light, one that illuminated not just her own path, but the paths of all those their story had touched. "They were wrong about so many things," Dawson murmured, as if reading her thoughts. "Yes," Nora agreed, watching as Hope successfully caught a firefly and showed her siblings the brief, magical glow. "But we were right to believe in better." And in that moment, as stars appeared above their home and their children's laughter mingled with the desert night sounds, Nora knew with absolute certainty that the journey, with all its pain and all its joy, had led exactly where she was meant to be.